to air. And we are live on Facebook at the moment, but we will be going live on radio within a few minutes, within a minute. $30. 22. Ten down.
We are Canberra Multicultural Service FM 91.1, where every culture finds its voice. Canberra's only full-time multicultural radio station. You can listen to us online at cmsradio.org.au or tune in to 91.1 on FM in your car, at home, anywhere. To broadcast or volunteer with us, give us a call at 6287 7058.
All right, welcome to Hello Canberra. This is HP, and you can listen to us in FM 91.1, and you're also watching us at Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok as well. So, hello Canberra. We don't have Kim today, as usual. Kim has ditched us. She's gone away. She's not here with us. Actually, she's sick, and we would like to wish her all the best, and hopefully she'll recover soon. She just back from Philippines, and we are here today talking about different things, different local issues and federal issues. There is an election around the corner at the moment, and we don't have a date yet, but we will be getting a date very soon. We have a special guest today. He's a political economist at ANU, and he's a PhD in political science as well. We'll be talking about politics, federal elections. We'll be talking about what is politics and what different things determines the voters and the interests as well. We have Ridesh Kajral today here with us. Ridesh, welcome to Hello Canberra.
Thanks very much, Ivanshu. Glad to be here.
And thanks for coming and doing this with us today. You've been a political economist for a while. You're Dr. Ridesh Kajral, right? So your expertise is in political science. Your expertise is in political economics, and you're also a researcher. So there's a lot of things that we would like to talk about today, especially with the federal elections. But before we start with the federal elections, right, a lot of people don't understand the whole narrative of politics. People don't like talking about politics or also be associated with politics. I approach a lot of people to talk about politics today, and a lot of people were a bit iffy in the sense that, okay, I may say something and it may have repercussions sometime later, which may not happen, but people have that thing with them, right? Let's talk about federal politics. Right, we just had a local elections here in Canberra in ACT, but ACT is also known to be the hub for federal politics, right? Tell me something about the basics, right? What is politics in very basic word for someone naive like me?
So basically, if you want to talk about politics in a very basic way, it's about who gets what, when, and where, right? And how as well. So it's the game of dividing things. It's the game of what is fair and what's not, because people come together to run a country, to kind of agree to be together, and they have to decide on certain things, on how to divide things up, on what is fair, what's not. and how to run the society. What is the nation about? And so all those things, a defining identity, all of those things require collective action. And you have different kinds of interest groups based on what they do, like business or worker, for example, based on their identities, based on various things that we call interest groups that would like to have things their way. And so they kind of, maybe it's a harsh way to put it, kind of fight it out. If you want to see politics as in those terms, right? Um, but yeah, other than that, besides politics being a game of fighting it out in the political arena, and interest groups basically, fighting it out, and people um, going after the things they want. Besides that, there's also the more, you could say, maybe positive things about um, who we are as a country,
Right.
let's say, right?
Right,
And
right.
what do we want to be about? Who do we want to help? Who do we want to lift up, right? Who do we want to prevent from being hurt? All those things as well. What are we as a society? So some of those philosophical aspects too. So yeah, I guess um, that's in a nutshell. That's what politics is about.
Going back to the history, right? So, when can you date back politics to? Like, is there a specific time in human history that you could actually pinpoint? This is when politics really started.
In many ways, I mean, there's different ways you can think about politics, right? So, do you want to think about politics in a formal way? If that's the case, and if you want to talk about democracy in particular, you can probably trace it back to ancient Greece, and then it starts from there. But we've had, if you want to include a lot of the autocratic monarchic systems as well, you can go all the way back to Egypt, ancient Egypt,
Yeah.
and the pharaohs. And if you want to take it even further, if you want to define politics in an even broader way, you could even take it back to all the tribes. Even
Right.
within tribes,
Yeah.
there's politics as well. There are chiefs, and there are, you could say, different interests.
So politics
competing and so forth.
politics really
It's
starts
everywhere.
from the
Yeah.
beginning of human civilization
Very
or
much.
human consciousness, as soon as we started becoming real humans, right?
Yeah.
From apes, probably, right?
Yeah, exactly. I
Yeah.
mean, the thing is, when you have different people wanting different things and coming together in that way, that's when politics happens. So
Yeah.
bees, for example, they live in a big group as well,
Yeah.
but they all kind of are programmed to do the same things. They
Yeah.
don't have different wants and needs, right? Now, so for that reason, they would not have politics. But because people, being social beings,
Yeah.
they come together with different interests, different opinions. And that's when you get politics. So you can get it from the tribe level all the way to the
Now-
international level.
Now, coming to politics here in the present time as well, we know that, and we've noticed. I was a part of a campaign a few months back as well, and what we've noticed is people. In general, are not very interested in what's happening, especially in Australia, right? Comparing to any other developing nations, it feels like we're more happy with what's happening, and we're not very interested in what's going on. Now, is this by program, or is this actually is it done on purpose, or is it the way the society is?
Well, a lot of people in Australia know about Australia being called a lucky country, right?
Yeah.
Now, that book is something else, but there's a kind of truth to that, to the fact that Australia is lucky in the sense that in the past 2-3 decades, Australia has benefited from a lot of things that has gone its way. For example, the rise of China,
Yeah.
right? And its massive demand for minerals and for iron ore and so forth, which Australia has benefited tremendously from. And yeah, a lot of things that have gone its way to make it a very affluent society. In terms of wealth ownership, I've read recently that Australia is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, right?
Yeah,
In terms
yeah.
of home
So,
ownership.
so
Yeah.
that actually resonates to why people are not very much interested in what's going on in politics, or don't
Yeah,
want to be.
so
Yeah,
yeah, when things are going relatively well for people, that's when they tune off in a way,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And when things are not going well for them, that's when it really counts. So that's
So,
when they
so,
tune back
so,
in.
but when you say that, in past few years, we can see that Australia, the way of things that's going on in Australia, is not as good as it's
Yeah,
supposed
yeah,
to be,
yeah,
right? So,
yeah.
there's cost of living going on. There's a whole lot of employment issues going on, and there's plenty of things with security and all this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, it's all. I mean, it's all relative, right? So
Yeah,
even for a country that is doing relatively well or is well off, you can compare it to its recent past, and maybe it's not doing that well in terms of
yeah,
its compared to its recent past, right? Even though, as a whole, from a global perspective,
yeah.
Australia is doing quite well. Yeah.
Yeah. So coming to real politics, right? So from the basics, always from the basics. Politics, the few different types of politics, or the forms of politics, right? Let's say democracy or autocracy or republican or a kingdom, so Australia is in between two different styles of politics, right? So we basically have a governor that's appointed by the palace in Buckingham, right? But then we are democracy that has a prime minister as well. All right. So how do you define this kind of setting? What is this setting?
Yes, I mean, it's Australia, which is Canada, is similar as well,
Yeah.
right? Their ultimate head of state is actually the king in
Yeah.
England at this moment. Now, in reality, so Australia has had a referendum on this,
Yeah.
in the 90s, and Australia said no to leaving
Yeah,
this and
yeah.
being an independent. Now, partly that's also because the way it actually plays out in practice is that there is no interference whatsoever
Right.
from the UK, right, coming in from Britain to Australia. So maybe people just like having a head of state, a celebratory kind of head of state. Maybe they associated that with their historical past, whatever it might be, whatever reasons it might be.
But this is still a
they have-
democracy, right? This is not a kingdom democracy. This is a democracy in Australia, isn't it?
I mean, technically speaking, in the
Yeah.
Constitution, the head of state, the king, is still
The head of
all
state, right?
powerful.
Yeah.
So, technically speaking, the king can still, tell Australia what to do.
Yeah.
But if he did, Australia wouldn't take it in
Yeah,
practice.
yeah.
It's not
And
how it works.
I think
in practice.
there's something written in Constitution where if something goes wrong, the governor has absolute power to dissolve the cabinet and then take absolute power in that sense, right? Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, there
Yeah.
was a time when the Governor General dismissed Gough Whitlam, and
Yeah.
that was a massive event in Australian politics. And so that kind of thing, there was a danger of that happening, and perhaps that's one of the reasons that the Republican movements kind of started as well. But something like that hasn't happened since then, and there's been pretty much no interference
Since then.
Then. So it's just on paper, it's a Commonwealth. It's
Yeah.
part of the king being the head of state. But in terms of everyday politics, it has no effect at all.
No. When it comes to teach me as your student, professor, right? Okay, so a lot of people don't understand the concept of left, right, and center. Right, when people like yourself or the media talks, they talk about center left or right or center right. What is that in terms of Australian politics? Who is left? Who is right? Who is center? And what determines a left, right, and center?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. I mean, I'll get into the nuances of that a bit
Right,
later. But
right.
as we understand in Australia, we can start from the current government, which is Labor,
Yeah.
and it's considered a center-left government, right?
Okay.
And then we have the Liberals, let's say, not the whole coalition. The Liberals, they're considered center-right.
Yeah.
Now, if you bring in the Nationals, some might try to put them little bit
Far
more
right?
to the not far right, more to the right
Yeah.
than the liberals. So they probably would be more right, right?
Yeah.
One Nation would be the far
Yeah.
right one.
Yeah.
And then to the left, you have, so you start with the center left, which is Labour, and then you would have the Greens,
Yeah.
and then you would have other parties that maybe not famous at this point in
Yeah.
Australia, but that spectrum goes that way,
Yeah.
right? So
But what
that-
tells who is what? You know, like who,
so I mean,
yeah.
so this is relative to. So what I was
Yeah.
going to say is that this is relative to. So if you brought over the Democratic Party from America to Australia, where do you think you'd be putting them in the spectrum?
Probably left.
So you would think that that's
Yeah,
the case,
yeah.
but they would probably sit more towards the center. They're probably more towards the right,
Right.
than our current Labor government.
Yeah.
So it's not set in stone. So it's not like everywhere you take, everywhere you go.
So it's relative to the society.
Yeah, I mean the
Yeah.
policy. So ultimately,
Yeah.
the reason we talk about right and left is because we're talking about certain policies, certain approaches, certain ideology,
Mhm.
right? So generally, center right has been associated with capitalism. Center left has been associated with social democracy.
Right.
Left has been associated with socialism,
Yeah.
right? And then right has been associated with I mean various things. The far right has been associated with fascism, of course.
Right,
You know,
right.
going back to the Nazis. So you have all those things.
Yeah.
But if you go to China, for example, right?
Yep.
So it's not straightforward, is what I'm trying to say. If you go to China, the conservatives might be the more Marxist
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
ones that are
Yeah.
there, and the
But
ones
there would be the left there.
and the ones that are more liberal might be considered left.
Yeah.
So it would be almost the opposite of of perhaps some European country or the U.S. So it's not set in stone in that sense.
So in Australia, Greens are left or far left. Let's say left or far left.
So I don't think there's a popular or well-known far left party in Australia.
Yeah.
There's the Socialist Alternative is a party, but they don't really do that
Okay.
well
Now,
in elections.
now let's go into this, right?
Yeah.
Capitalist, socialist, fascist, right? A lot of people have heard these terms, and unless you go to the university or you're really interested in politics, people don't make out what exactly it is, right? So what does, let's say, if I were to be a socialist, what would be my thinking?
So as far as socialism is concerned, it's a very broad church, as they say, right? So, and it's got all kinds of beliefs, and it's also very nebulous, right? So some people, for example, might call countries in Scandinavia like Sweden socialist, but maybe the Swedish people themselves would say we're not socialist, we're social democracy,
Yeah.
right? And that's probably more accurate, right? Because they are still market-based capitalist economies. They tax very highly, and so they redistribute a lot of that money that comes through the market. But they still, the market is still dominant, in the economy, right? So that's one way of defining whether, let's say, a nation, a political economy, is capitalist or socialist. In a socialist, I mean, so these terms also come from Karl Marx, right?
Yeah.
And Karl Marx actually spelled out these terms, but it goes before Karl Marx as well. So he was a critic of capitalism,
Mhm.
and he described capitalism a lot. So he talked about capitalism a lot.
Mhm.
So there's a lot more he has said about capitalism than he has said about socialism or communism. So in that sense, people know what capitalism is a lot more than what people know what socialism is.
So my
communism is.
question to you
Yeah.
was, if I was a socialist, what would be my view today? What, like, just on a very short, just
Okay, so
yeah.
socialism in the way we understand it historically is opposition to capitalism, right? And so if capitalism is
Money, so all business
it's not
is
just money.
capitalism.
Is what is called technically the private ownership of the means of production.
So that's capitalism.
Yeah. So
okay, hold on. So private
ownership
of
the means of production.
Of the means of production is capitalism.
In the Marxist sense, right? Marxist definition.
So that's capitalism.
And then, so if you make it collective, the collective ownership of the means of production, that becomes socialist.
Collective.
In the
let's
traditional
so
sense.
give me an example, right?
Mhm.
So if I own a factory today,
Yeah.
right, I'm a capitalist. But how would I be a socialist if I own a
So
factory and
if your workers take over and then they start running the factory and own the factory as a collective, that's a
right?
socialist.
Okay.
So in those terms, yeah.
And a fascist would be
So a fascist is someone who is between is very different in the sense that so sometimes people confuse Nazi, National Socialism with
yeah,
socialism, right?
yeah,
It was fascism. It wasn't like socialism in the way that we just defined it, for
yeah.
example. So fascism is actually anti socialism, anti communism, right? So when Hitler came around in Germany, they fought off the communists and the social democrats at that time. They were sworn enemies. Um, and what fascists did, or fascism wanted, was basically one leader to lead the whole country, and the whole country to be a highly militaristic, imperialistic kind of entity, right? So as one entity. So you basically treat everyone
But that's
as
collective,
being
right?
part.
So they were doing something collective, though.
No, but
But
not collectively. So
collectively,
the
right?
key there is one person decides in
Right.
fascism,
Okay.
whereas in the socialism that we described, the collective ownership,
Right.
everybody decides. So they
Right.
decide as a collective, at least in theory.
So
Yeah.
in Australia, Labor socialist,
I
liberal
wouldn't.
capitalist.
Yeah, I wouldn't call labor
No.
socialist. No,
So labor would be sort of capitalist, sort of socialist,
social democracy.
social
So
democracy.
that's important to define as well. So social
Yeah.
democracy, and again, the perfect example of social democracy are the Scandinavian countries,
Right.
right? Like Denmark,
And
Sweden, and all of them.
and the liberals would be more capitalist, is it? More business
Yes,
friendly.
pro
So the
business, yeah,
pro
pro
business,
business,
yeah,
neoliberal. Well, so there's a more technical term or more nuanced term, which is a neoliberal.
yeah, yeah.
So basically, not just capitalist,
Right.
but a free market capitalist.
Right. Okay. Okay. Now coming to Australia, the federal election. The reason we had to do this warm up was to make the listeners and the viewers understand exactly what we are talking about. Right now, coming down to Labor, Liberal, Greens, whom to vote. People are always confused. Whom should I vote? Normally, people vote because my grandfather voted for Labor, my dad voted for Labor. I'm gonna vote for Labor, or my grandfather voted for Liberal. I'm gonna vote for Liberal. Some sort of that lineage normally comes down as well at times, but when it comes to real vote time, right? How much does the policies really matter? Is a question to be asked, right? Is it more lineage? Is it more the color and the picture of people that is on the cornfields and on now on social media and on Facebook, or is it the policy? What does your research
Yeah,
say?
that's well, I don't research that
Yeah,
specifically, but
yeah,
so as far as the lineage is concerned, like you said, right? So people, my father voted whatever Labor. That's why I vote. My grandfather. Now we think that it's just people copying their
yeah,
parents.
yeah.
But what a political science analyst might tell you is that it's a class-based vote.
Yeah.
Oftentimes it can
Yeah.
be. So politics used to be class-based.
Yeah.
So there was the working class, and then there was what you call the middle class, right?
Mhm.
Now the upper, rich class of such
Yeah.
a small percentage of the population that they don't really count in this. But
Mhm.
so you'd have the middle class, which are the professional office workers and so forth, and then the working class, right? And that was the main contest back in the day for a long time. And so basically, Labor was the representative of the working class, and then Liberal, for example, here, right, would be the representative of the middle class.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And Nationals usually tended to be the representatives of farmers and so forth. So
Yeah.
countryside. So you had that combination. So it's the
Right.
classes
Yeah.
being attached to those parties,
Mhm.
but that's no longer the case. And that's been slipping away more and more. And partly because the working class in the way we understand it is kind of disappearing from the global north and going towards the global south.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
a lot of factories have closed in Australia, in America, right? And then people, so those jobs have shifted to China and
Yeah. Yeah.
other parts of Asia and so forth. So you don't necessarily have that kind of distinction anymore. And so for that reason, that lineage is breaking down. So what you're talking about, right, is kind of breaking down. So a lot of people are voting against the opposite party of what their parents used to vote, or that there's there might not be much relation at
So
all.
that comes to the recent poll shifts, right? So there's been a recent poll shifts towards Labour by 51-49. Now it keeps changing. This may not be the recent data. This is a data from a day before when I was doing research for this show. But when I was looking at it, there was a poll shift, right? So how does this poll shift? I mean, is it because Anthony Albanese is in Queensland and he's come up with a new policy, or is it because Dutton has gone to Western Australia and he's said something? Does that matter when it comes to shifting of the polls, especially the pre-polls right at the moment? So
Yeah, and there's so it's hard to say exactly what's shifting polls.
yeah,
But you can think of it in a general way
Yeah.
of what things shift a poll. So, for example, if there's a economic crisis and people are not doing well, they will not be satisfied. That will show up in the polls,
Yeah.
right? If people are facing a cost of living crisis, that will show up in the polls.
But in this
And so,
case, the cost of living is under the present government.
yeah.
And the poll is going on the favor of the present government, right? So
Well, no, it's the way that it worked out is until this recent turn, right? So
Yeah.
recently the polls have been shifting towards Labour,
Yeah.
in the favor of Labour. But more recently, in the past maybe 6 months or even more, since the Voice since the Voice
since the
vote
Voice.
is when it started turning, the Liberals have been ahead in most polls, right? And that's probably a combination of a lot of things. So one is the cost of living crisis. The other might be the Voice and the Prime Minister being associated with the Voice and that failing, and then maybe that is having an effect on him. This Israel-Gaza war
Yeah.
has had an effect in Australia as well, probably. And so a lot of factors kind of go into what shifts people's opinions.
Now, what are we seeing at the moment worldwide? I can't say in specific to Australia, but this is my feeling. There's no data to it, but this is my feeling that even in Australia, I can feel the shift towards the right. Right, there's a shift towards more nationalism. There's a shift towards more anti-immigrant, sentiments. There's more shift towards we can build our country ourselves. We don't need anyone from across the nations. Right, this started especially from the United States, and of course it affects the entire world. But I have felt that in my communication with different people, right? Do you think that there has been a shift in people's perception towards voting the left or opposed to the right?
So you mean has like the Trump effect?
Yeah. Has there been a Trump effect in Australia?
Is that going to be repeated in Australia?
Yeah. That's what I mean. Yeah.
So there's two ways to think about it. One is that because so many people followed Trump's rise and followed the U.S. politics, right? So people might be influenced in that way. The other way is that it might be a reaction to Trump, right?
Yeah.
So that's what's happening in Canada. So if you don't know, so there's what was happening with the current Liberal government. So Liberal over there is kind of like center left, right? Center left.
Yeah.
In Canada, so Justin Trudeau, who had been Prime Minister for a long time now, 3 terms, he was becoming very unpopular. So it was almost, he was losing by a lot in the opinion polls. Since Trump came in, and put in the tariffs, Trudeau kind of
has resurfaced.
Yeah, has resurfaced. No, not Trudeau, but so Trudeau
Yeah.
has actually given way to another candidate,
Yeah.
Carney, right?
Yeah.
So he is now popular. So basically, but Trudeau was becoming popular when he stood up to Trump.
Mhm.
So when he stood up for Canada, right, against Trump, who was saying, "I'm going to conquer Canada and I'm going to take over Canada. I'm going to, not going to. They actually put on raised tariffs by like 25% on Canadian products like steel and so on." So there was this reaction that happened against Trump in Canada, which favored the center left in this case, right? So the Conservatives were winning in the election polls by a lot, right? But that has just disappeared and gone the other way in a matter of a few weeks, right? So. So that can happen in Australia as well. You never know. So you can have the opposite effect of what you think will happen.
And what I was trying to say was, has that Donald Trump effect Have you seen anything, or in your data or in your regular, communications? Have you seen that Donald Trump effect in Australia? Or I can see, like, what we were just seeing. I was reading the news today, and I can see that more and more Australians are not buying a Tesla because of the affiliation of Elon Musk towards Donald Trump, right? So they've had to bring a lot of different, schemes to sell their Tesla cars. Them thousands of hundreds or thousands of Tesla cars right now, right? How how do you see that? I see more, right, but then when I see Australian community effect, like, showing their dissatisfaction that way, I'm a bit
See,
confused.
it's this. I mean, there's two trends, right? So,
Yeah,
for example, the indicator that there's a Trump effect happening in Australia is
yeah,
probably through One Nation,
yeah,
right? So, with Pauline Hanson,
yeah.
Pauline Hanson's party, if its vote is rising, that's probably a good indication that the Trump effect is happening
Mm-hmm,
in Australia. Now, One Nation's vote has been rising, maybe in the past year or so,
mm-hmm,
right? So it's gone to around, but it's never above 10%.
mm-hmm.
It's around like 7-8% in the opinion polls. Um, and so you can't really say that there's been like a massive Trump effect, which is because, One Nation is that party focused on immigration, focused on borders, focused on nationalism, even they idolize Trump and so forth. So that's not happened there. Now the effect against Tesla, right? Yeah, you can see that happening not only in America but also in Australia as well. And so there's that group as well, which becomes even more kind of anti-right or
Yeah,
anti-Trump
yeah.
because of those things. So
So it's
multiple effects. So
so
yeah,
it may be
it affects on
reciprocal,
multiple,
or it may not be
and they
reciprocal at
might
the same
cancel
time.
each other out.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
what it is, and that's what we could see here, right? In Australia, in the elections in Australia, probably, right? Now, the cost of living has been the most important part of this election. Lots of us, we know that the cost of living has started, especially post COVID, right? And post COVID was also Russia Ukraine war, right? How much of that has affected cost of living? Because a lot of people think cost of living is due to the government, but it's never due to the government, right? It's more to do with the global events, right? So
It's again, there's multiple factors,
yeah,
right? So I mean, definitely Ukraine war was a big part of it. COVID was definitely big. It started it.
yeah,
COVID and the supply chain issues that COVID caused, the border closures caused, was definitely part of the start of inflation,
right,
right?
right,
And right after that, the Ukraine war happened, and then grain and all these important resources were constrained, and then that led to another price spike. Then kind of OPEC decided to restrain, OPEC is the oil
yeah,
producing countries association. They decided to restrict oil too in order to make good profit, right? So all of those things happened at the same time. And then there was this global inflation spike in inflation, right? Now, once, according to economic theories at least, once that happens, once you have inflation, what happens is that workers start asking for a pay rise,
mhm,
and because they cannot, they can't afford the same things anymore.
mhm,
So they started switching jobs, or they ask for a pay rise. And when they get a pay rise, when that actually happens, that can add to inflation as well.
mhm,
Now, in this case, that probably hasn't happened a lot. Back in the past, in the 70s, 80s, it used to happen when unions were powerful. Right now, unions
yeah,
are not that powerful. Um, and there is the matter, and this was the argument of what is called the monetarist or the neoliberals, is that the governments should not spend too much, especially if there's inflation, because if you add more money to the economy, that will raise prices.
So what has happened in this case? Government has spent too much in Australia. Have we seen
Again,
that trend?
it's not simple. You cannot connect.
Yeah.
So there's no, again, this is not my specific
Yeah, yeah, of course,
specialization,
yeah,
but
but
usually you cannot connect it right away to a government spending money and that raising inflation. The Labour Party actually has been, unconventionally for its own old identity, very restrained in terms of spending money. So in fact, when they came into government, their first budget was not spectacular at all. Usually there's some big spending measures and so on,
yeah,
but
yeah,
it wasn't, right. And the main message of that budget was, okay, we have to constrain, we have to bring back, we have to make sure during times of inflation that we don't overspend. So the government itself subscribes to that theory, or
Yeah.
the idea that government spending raises inflation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they have kind of constrained or restrained themselves from doing that, right? So in that sense, because they themselves have been conscious, I wouldn't think that government has played a big role in. And the fact is, despite different governments existing around the world of different political colors, inflation has shown up in the same kind of trend in different countries around the
everywhere,
world.
right?
So everywhere it's
yeah.
gone up, spiked up, and then come down pretty much around the same time.
Yeah.
So the actions of government doesn't really seem to matter that much.
Right? But then it's always a political issue, and of course the opposition would always say, hey, let's say miraculously tomorrow Peter Dutton wins, right? And this is very hypothetical, but then if Peter Dutton wins and becomes the prime minister, would he be able to miraculously change the cost of living?
But it's already changing. So the lucky thing for Labour is that the first interest rate cut came before the election. Right. So now they can have this narrative that we did the hard work, right? We restrained ourselves. We had to make sure that we bring the cost of living down, and we did that. And the proof of that is the interest rate cut by the Reserve Bank in February, right? And so they can point to that. Labour can point to that. So now the likely trend, and a lot of economists and banks predict this as well, is that inflation is going to keep going down, at least not go up again. And so ultimately the interest rates are going to come down, right? The current prediction is that. So it's going to keep coming down. Maybe not in a fast way, but
and that would check the cost of living issue, so that would bring that down. So they've got lucky in that sense then. And now comes the housing affordability, and this is something I'm very passionate about, right? Because housing affordability is basically they join housing affordability with immigration. And me being us being an immigrant, we think that's not the case. We think there are other factors to it, and not immigration only, right? And I know people that are students that are in major cities. They share the rooms. They're 2 or 3 people living in one room. So I don't think so. That's the housing affordability, but given the housing affordability crisis, right, affecting especially young Australians, how do you think that would shape the elections?
So the kind of old wisdom, conventional wisdom in politics used to be that young people always vote left. So no matter what you do, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right. But that's changing. So I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later too. But in the US, a lot of young people, especially young men, voted for Trump. Right. And that was supposed to be the crowd for the secure vote for the Democrats.
Yeah.
So then that's been the case here, that kind of thinking has been the case here as well. And that's probably one of the reasons that both parties, both mainstream parties, have not acted on housing affordability. This has been a constant issue in Australia in the past 2 decades.
But the arrow is always pointing towards immigration, right? And we'll talk about immigration as well. So I do not want your opinion, but what I think myself is immigration is not the key to housing affordability. What I'm trying to ask you is, will housing affordability be a key issue for a voter to choose whom to vote?
As always, probably, right? Now it depends on who you look at. So, okay, well, let's just come back to whether or not immigration is associated with housing affordability.
Yeah.
Now, what I can say about that is housing, before this immigration was connected to housing affordability recently. Even before that, housing affordability has always been a problem in Australia for a long time now.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has to do with government policy, bipartisan government policy now, right? To do with negative gearing, to do with capital gains tax, all those things that promote the buying of houses, right? So what that then does is raise the housing prices. It's pretty straightforward,
Yeah, yeah,
and most people, it's quite obvious that those are the issues they have to tackle in order to improve housing affordability.
exactly.
Immigration might be a small part of that, might not be. I'm not sure, right? But if it is, it's a small part of it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So these policies, existing government policies, are more associated with housing affordability than immigration. I
So,
believe.
as you were just telling me, traditionally it's more young people voting the left,
Yeah.
right? But there's been a shift. There's been a change. They've termed this as lad vote, and there's more to do with the United States. But they've termed this as lad vote, and they've seen this trend. Youngsters under 35 have started shifting their votes towards the right, right? And this is where every political guru is confused here in Australia,
Mhm.
right? What's going to happen? Because traditionally, as you say, you go towards left if you're a young person, because it's great. It's great to be young and go towards the left, because as usual, rights are always more conservative and more traditional. Why has this happened?
Okay. So, well, first, let me just put a caveat on that, right? So it hasn't shifted in the sense that it's not like all young men are now voting right? So it's a proportional shift. It's a relative shift, right?
All right.
But having said that, so there are more people moving towards the right, at least in the American election, there were, right? Now, how is that happening? I believe it has to do with one, the conditions, economic conditions that young people find themselves in.
Yeah.
So it's hard to find a job, hard to find housing. There's no housing affordability. There's all these problems that are happening, right? It's hard for young people. One. So how do they deal with that? For a lot of them, it might take the form of anger, for example, right? And it's also how people channel that frustration that they have. Now, there has been this rising trend of social media and podcasts, and there's
Yeah.
people in podcasts like Joe Rogan or Pete Jordan Peterson, whoever, who are more towards the right, or at least center right, and they talk about issues in a certain way, and that they have a broad, big audience of young men usually, right? And then they listen to those issues, and maybe that affects some of their way of thinking as well.
Right.
And also, because the establishment hasn't served young, poor working class people for a very, very long time, it might just be a way of young people to show their anger.
Yeah.
So yeah, that might be the case.
What do you think? I mean, right now, are the challenges for independence? Right, there've been few independents that has actually come into Senate, and we see a really big wave of independence. We have things like Climate 200 supporting independence as well. We saw David Pocock getting elected last term as well, backed by Climate 200, right? And everybody knows that. And there's a huge popularity for David Pocock as we talk, and for independence as well. Do you think there will ever be only independents elected? Is this? I know
No.
this is like a Star Wars kind of thing. But
Well,
then,
the funny thing is
Yeah.
that's actually kind of what the Constitution imagined.
yeah,
That all the MPs in Parliament, right, members of Parliament, would actually have their own voice. Would be
would be more
independent.
independent.
Yeah, so all of them would be they might be part of parties or even independent.
Yeah.
And so that was the original kind of idea of the Parliament, right, or the Constitution, let's say. But these days, it's very different from what was imagined at that point, which is now there's massive, two main parties, and they all speak with one voice collectively.
yeah.
And it's through what is
So
called
there's a whip there
yeah,
to
it's a whip. It's because of
Yeah.
the whipping system. There is no what is called conscience vote.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
And so you have everybody voting the same way, even if they don't believe in that vote, voting
Yeah.
that way.
yeah,
So, in that sense, what you said, Parliament being full of independents, we are probably very far away from that, to the opposite of that, basically. But is there a prospect of that happening? Probably not in the party system, because the parties are too powerful. I mean,
Yeah.
they have already collected a lot of investment. People associate their vote, through either tradition or whatever
Tradition
it might
or
be,
the color.
their
Yeah.
presence, right?
Yeah.
It's just, basically when they get asked questions, or sometimes in polls, it's just like, who are you going to vote for, coalition or Labor, right?
Yeah.
That already rules out a lot of people. And so, and even though there's more information
Yeah.
now because of the web and everything, people still don't care that much about politics that they go out finding out about
Yeah.
independence
Yeah.
and who they are.
Yeah.
What do they do? What are they going to bring? How do we trust them? Do they have credibility? You have to know so many things about independence to vote for them.
Exactly.
So that kind of
But do you
stands as a
see more of independence coming in this year?
To be honest, no. The reason is
Okay.
because
Now this is very interesting for me. Come on. Why no?
I mean, the reason is because so there are a lot of already teals. I'm not saying that there will be no more independence. There probably will be, but I don't think there will be a wave of independence.
Yeah.
Because I think that wave of independence has probably kind of maybe peaked, or maybe is about to peak, or whatever it might be. Because the teals, as they are called, they come from usually electorates where that vote the coalition, right?
Yeah.
Liberals generally, right?
Yeah.
Now, because the liberals have shifted to the right, they created that gap in the middle, in the center, and especially related to climate change, right? So because they were completely, they had no policies on climate change, the liberals, right? They were almost to the point of denying, some of them actually were denying climate change, right?
Yeah.
Because of that, there was frustration in these rich neighborhoods, rich educated neighborhoods that very much subscribe to the idea that, scientific idea that climate change is happening, something needs to do about it. They couldn't vote for the liberals because of that. So, but they couldn't vote for Labor either because they had traditionally not voted for them. And economically, Labor, in their eyes, would be bad for them through higher taxes or whatever else it might be.
Yeah, exactly.
So they chose the teal vote.
Yeah.
Right? Now, from that perspective, for us to have more independence, you would need the climate issue to grow much more significantly here.
Yeah.
Right? Now, has that been the case? I don't think so. Since the last election, I don't think there has been a huge, burst in growth in terms
and
of
also there's also this whole debate going on. Okay, you go in as an independent. Well, good. That's like a protest vote as well. Can you call an independent going in, as a protest vote? Is that
yeah, that can happen.
Scientific?
I mean, so basically, usually when voters vote, they usually vote for the party, right? Like that's well known. They vote for the mainstream party,
right?
So Labor or Liberal, rather than the candidate. Sometimes candidate matters, but more than that, usually it's known that. So, for example, sometimes famous candidates have gone out of their party and run as independent.
Yeah.
They almost always lose.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So they almost always lose. So it's the party that people generally vote for. And so because of that, so it makes it hard for independence.
So there is a whole debate going on where they say, okay, independence, good, good independence should go in, we'll vote for independence and all this kind of stuff. But how effective can they be, when they are in Senate or when they are in the House of Reps?
It depends on how close the election is. So, for example, in this election, it might matter more because it's probably going to be a close election.
So they go and sit down on the crossbench or form a coalition or whatever.
I mean, the best thing for the independent. So there has been an election, for example, Julia Gillard's second term, when she had to rely on an independent in order to form government. So the independent ended up having a lot of power. It was a kingmaker, as it's called. So they had a lot of power in their hands, so they got a lot of concessions.
Yeah.
Now, usually independents get concessions for their own electorate, so they get voted again next time. But they can have power, but it's rare. Usually, and because a lot of the things happened in the lower house, so the
House of
Representatives, rather than the Senate. The House of Representatives generally, that's where parties dominate, right?
Yeah.
The winning parties
but
dominate.
So far, in your reading, right, how would you rate the performance of independence?
Performance in what
their
sense?
performance in Senate or in House of Rep, when they're, if you see their track record,
Yeah.
have you seen any sort of performance level gone up or gone down, or
Yeah.
have they contributed something?
I mean, yeah. So
Yeah.
so for example, Pocock is from Canberra, right?
Yeah.
He has had some influence in politics.
Yeah.
I mean, see, the thing is, in the Senate, so
Yeah.
because he has some power in the Senate, some
Yeah.
influence in the Senate, he can have some say. But that's usually when the Greens are not agreeing, because Greens actually have the balance of power. The
Okay.
main balance of power.
You mean when the Greens are not Greens?
Yeah, when
Yeah.
when Greens and Pocock disagree is only when Pocock can have kind of more influence in
Yeah.
politics.
Yeah.
If the Greens and Pocock are agreeing, if Greens agree to the Labour government's
Yeah.
policy, for
Yeah.
example,
Yeah.
usually they don't end up needing Pocock's vote, right?
Yeah.
So in that case, Pocock has less influence.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if the Greens and Labour they don't agree on things, or they disagree on policies,
Yeah.
that's when Pocock will have bigger influence.
Yeah.
Right. So, and the thing with Pocock is usually independents, they try to do what's best for their electorate.
Yeah.
Usually focus on their electorate,
Yeah.
right? Getting infrastructure and things
Yeah.
like that. But Pocock has been quite very outspoken on climate and a lot of other issues.
Yeah.
Intergenerational well-being, those kinds of issues. So he has been able to kind of bring those to the fore.
To the fore. Yeah.
And maybe that is the power that independents have, is that the camera time that they get to speak about issues, right? Versus anyone from Labour who's not the prime minister or one of the top politicians, they don't really appear in the media.
And
very
probably
much.
that's what party whip kind of thing takes place there, because only the leader can speak and the other ones don't. I think that's what happens.
You kind of assume that they all have the same, they're going to vote the same way in the parliament. So there's no point talking to each and every one of them, I guess.
Yeah. So of course there's a big wimp going on about the independence at the moment. Anyways, in the local elections we saw that as well. We're seeing that in the federal elections as well, and the fundings the regulations of fundings have changed, right? What do you think? Like the recent changes in the fundings, right, of the candidates, that restricts a lot of independence. Don't you think so?
I mean, this is predictable from the big parties, right? Like they don't want challengers coming through
to the status quo.
And when they have this kind of chance to do a bipartisan vote, they will, because it's for their benefit, and that's one of the the loopholes of democracy almost, right? So unfortunately, that's the effect,
and that's gonna make a huge effect for the independence in the terms of fundings, because of course in elections you need a lot of fundings anyhow. Well, you can run elections without fundings as well, but then to reach out to a lot of people, you need a lot of volunteers, and and as an independent, you don't have those resources. Anyhow, there are other things like the climate change, right? And that has taken a back seat at the moment in the politics here in Australia. Climate change normally is always at the forefront, but then in Australia, right now, that has just taken a back seat. What do you think? Why has that happened? Why is everything going towards the right sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, this has to do with the 24-hour news cycle, as they call it, right? The short-termism of politics, because climate change is a very long. It's happening fast in a historical way, but it's still not happening in a way where people can feel it every day changing. And some issues like cost of living, housing affordability, those are felt much more in a much more immediate way by people, of course, than climate change, right? And so that's been the focus, and especially because it's a cost of living crisis, and acting on climate change involves maybe adding costs, right? Adding costs in the sense that of going renewables or other kinds of government taking certain actions, certain policies that might cost things, right? So that's at least the perception among people, that acting on climate change is costly, right? But in the end, what's going to happen is if countries as a whole, the world acts on climate change, it's going to end up costing a lot less overall. Right. But that's people don't have time to think in that way, I guess. Yeah,
Well,
and
we have about 5 to 7 minutes remaining today. And there's a lot of things to be spoken about, especially we're trying to be very balanced. I just want to let the viewers or the listeners know that we're not trying to steer people and ask people or influence people on whom to vote. We're just trying to educate people how the system is working and what does the system say, right? But when I say that, there is a lot of nervousness going on at the moment in the immigrant community, right? If Dutton wins, if the Liberal win, what if similar things happen? What's happening in the United States, right? Do you think that's possible here in Australia, given the fact that Australians are more, welcoming, and Australia is built on the basis of immigration?
so there's one key difference between America and Australia, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to this. So America has what is called a presidential system, and Australia has what is called a parliamentary system, right? So the presidential system has one executive president, and so a lot of the changes that have come since Trump has been through his power as a president,
Right.
as an executive, right? Now, the judicial arm is trying to stop some of that, but he has the power as one person, as the leader, the president, to act unilaterally. So basically, do a lot of things by himself, make a lot of orders by himself. You don't have that kind of thing in Australia.
Yeah.
So in Australia, a prime minister has to convince her or his party, right? First of all, his cabinet, and of course, depending on what parliament is like, the parliament as well, so, and the Senate as well, in order to pass laws, in
Yeah.
order to pass
Yeah.
certain policies.
Unless they have absolute majority, and again, they have to go back down to the party to get that sorted, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
So in that
yeah.
sense, the political system of Australia constrains the political leader, the prime minister in this case, from acting like Trump.
Yeah.
So it's unlikely.
But is this true that Liberals are more anti-immigrants and Labours are more pro-immigrants?
Really
When I
depends.
say that, is that correct?
I mean, really depends. So basically, you have different wings within the Liberal Party as well, right?
Yeah.
So you have someone like Malcolm Turnbull, for example, who you wouldn't think is anti-immigrant. He's probably pro-immigration. He's more of a liberal in the small L
Yeah.
sense, as they say it. Whereas they have been factions in the Labour Party,
Yeah.
groups of people. I wouldn't say factions, groups
Yeah.
of people who, because of the competition that immigrants bring in the labour market,
Yeah.
have been against immigration
And
for
what
that
about
reason.
what
too.
about
So,
Greens? What about Greens? Where do they stand in immigration?
I mean, generally speaking, from what I've seen,
Yeah.
their policies is usually pro-immigration.
Right.
However, I guess it depends on what kind of immigration
faction?
you're talking about.
Yeah.
So more than faction, it's like what kind of immigration you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So is it to undercut people's wages, right? If that's the case, because a lot of companies do want to bring in workers and pay less,
Yeah.
and then undercut
Yeah.
wage.
Yeah, of course.
So if that kind of immigration, they would probably be against. I'm assuming.
Yeah.
And most parties would. But other than that, I haven't heard any kind of rhetoric from them that would kind of blame immigrants
Right.
for.
See,
things like that.
Ridesh, we'll be anyways calling you back again to do more analysis on after the election has been called in. The election hasn't yet been called in yet, but once the election has been called in, we'll bring you back and we'll do more analysis on this. But let's say today, if the election was, say, tomorrow or the day after, right? What would you tell the voters? How should the voters vote? What's your suggestion, or what would be your suggestion to the voters? Like if it was me, I would say, hey, look into the policies. Don't look into the banner. Don't look into the color of the banner, right? Look into the policies, because politics is what changes your future and your children's future, right? And be more involved. Something like that. What do you suggest?
Yeah, I mean, something similar to that.
Yeah.
So basically, don't be fooled by the parties, right? One is that, and then think long term as well, right? Not just short term. Think also long term, the next generation, and do your research. That's important.
Before you go to vote.
Before you go to vote, what policies are bringing in, not just what policies the parties are proposing, but also what those policies actually do. And there will be, universities, media commentators, journalists, and so forth that will try to break it down
Yeah.
for people in terms of the policy's effects. ABC News is good at that kind
Yeah.
of thing as
Yeah.
well. You have The Conversation, which is another kind of
Well,
academically
we will do that
oriented
as well.
stuff. Yeah.
We will do that in future in this show as well with you.
Yeah.
We will dissect the policies if we can, and if we get the time, we'll dissect what the policies mean. Especially there are lots of policies with the supermarket. The pricing of supermarket, medical, the health, dental, security, and we'll dissect them and how it would affect people like us, right? Especially, for us as a mid income earner, or a business person, whatever. Yeah. So thank you, Ridesh, for coming in today and doing this with us. I hope you
Thanks for
enjoyed
having me. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed the
I
conversation.
did.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
Yeah, it was great, and it's about time for us to go. But before you go, is there anything that you'd like to say?
Not really. Looking forward to the election and the election campaign. Let's see how it plays out. Looking forward to chatting about that.
Right, no worries. So, Ridesh, thank you for coming in. Hello, Canberra is the show. You're listening to CMS Radio 91.1. We are about 30 seconds to switch on to the other show. And if you're driving, if you're listening to us, and if you are watching later on after the live show as well, you can comment, you can talk to us. We have some comment here, but that would be later. A great chat today. Thanks. That's Dana Granville that has just told us. Other than that, if you want to really talk to us and chat, let us know, comment, and we will get Ridesh back again talking about the federal elections. Thank you so much watching and listening to us at CMS Radio 91.1. Bye-bye.